So in today's talk, we are approaching normative theory construction from a deontological perspective, and we will look at the work of three prominent deontologists, Immanuel Kant, John Rawls, and the contemporary philosopher Rainer Forst from Germany. He's alive and well. Kant and Rawls have passed on. So we're going to go into a summary in some detail of their deontological methodologies to normative justification. Wanted to begin, though, with this basic diagram that illustrates the levels of normative consideration. And there are three broad levels, one could argue. At the most general level, at the tip of the arrow, we have judgment as the application of principles to the justifiability of laws, etc. So at this level, we're asking, are our laws or policies or practices, institutions, institutional rules, are they justifiable? And we seek that justifiability in terms of their consistency with principles of justice. So do laws, etc., comport or comply with our principles of justice, whatever they might be. And there are different conceptions of justice that entail different principles of justice. But we also have to ask whether the principles of justice that we have agreed to and affirmed, are those principles justifiable in themselves? And that leads us to a more basic level of consideration, the first level of consideration, which is what the justification of those principles based upon certain criteria or reasons of justification, which we can refer to as meta-normative, in the sense, meta referring to prior to. So prior to the principles, can we identify and then apply in some way the criteria, these meta-normative criteria, to justify our principles of justice? And most of the work in terms of normative theory construction, or an important part of the work of normative justification and normative theorizing, is the identification of these meta-normative criteria and how to apply them in the process. What method can we use to apply them in the process of justifying our principles of justice? So that's a big picture overview of what we're up to here. So given that, we can turn to Immanuel Kant. Oops. And Kant was a 18th century philosopher in Germany, Prussia at the time. Germany as such didn't exist yet, but his native language was German, and he wrote in German. And one of the great, of course, Kant is one of the great philosophers in the history of Western philosophy. He's one of the real giants of Western philosophy, and ushered in many ways, modern philosophy in the 18th century, including a modern theory moral theory or moral philosophy, if you will. And the focus for Kant was on what he called imperatives. And our interest here is to understand the imperatives, in particular the categorical imperative and its three formulations, as the metanormative criteria for the justification of principles of justice, and how those criteria are to be used in a procedure of construction. So that's what, and that has been very influential over the course of the next 250 years, and shaped a whole tradition of theorizing that Rawls and Forst are members of, and working in the tradition that Kant initiated. There are many others as well, but Rawls and Forst are prominent exemplars of the Kantian deontological tradition. So Kant identified imperatives as duties, and as duties they pertain to what ought to be. They are necessary commands of reason, Kant maintained. And he maintained that the will, our capacity for choice, volition, in the moral domain, should choose principles that are based in reason, that recognize what is good independently of our inclinations, that is, our desires, tastes, conceptions of the good, etc., our values. And so for any action to be morally good, Kant writes in the metaphysical ground of it is not enough that it should conform to the moral law. It must also be done for the sake of the moral law. So one has to consciously choose, for good reason, one's maxims in order for them to be valid. And importantly, quote, an action done for duty has its moral worth, not in the purpose to be obtained by it, but in the maxim in accordance with which it is decided upon. It depends solely on the principle of volition in accordance with which the action has been performed. This means that in order for a duty to be valid or action to be morally correct, to have moral worth, it must be in accordance, it must be chosen in accordance with a particular maxim or principle. And maxims are, for Kant, subjective principles of action and not necessarily objective law. And there are two kinds of imperatives: hypothetical imperative, which is commanded as a means to an end or an imperfect duty, and the categorical imperative, which is necessary for its own sake, and it is normatively objective. It is a perfect duty. So, and in this sense, Kant is appealing to what he's calling here a categorical imperative as the metanormative criteria upon which we test and validate the justifiability of our maxims or our principles, including our public principles of justice. And there are three formulations of the categorical imperative. The first, which we could abbreviate by CI1, reads as follows: I ought never to act except in such a way that I can also will that my maxim should become a universal law, end quote. Or act only on that maxim which can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Or act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. This suggests that duty has to hold for all rational beings. So from this perspective, we would use a procedure, a decision procedure. First, we would formulate a maxim that enshrines our plan of action. Second, we would recast that maxim as a universal law of nature, governing all rational agents, and holding that all must by natural law act as you yourself propose to act in these circumstances. The third step would consider whether a maxim is even conceivable in a world governed by this new law. Is it even conceivable? And then fourth, ask yourself whether you would or could rationally will to act on your maxim in such a world. If you could, then your action is morally permissible. So, for example, let's say my maxim is, I will only help others when it is in my self-interest to do so. I will only help others when it is in my self-interest to do so. So that's a maxim. That's a principle. Another principle might be, a principle of justice might be, we should distribute the goods of society based upon gender. And in that, males should get more of the resources and goods of the society than females. That's a principle, a maxim, if you will. Kant would then have us ask, well, is that justifiable? Would that maxim be justifiable? Could we if we made it into a universal law, if we projected that, this would be the law of nature. He's not saying it's a law of nature, but if we would imagine it as a law of nature, is that a world we could conceive of? Is that a world that we would endorse as wanting to live in as a just world? So if we take the maxim, my maxim is, I will only help others if it serves my self-interest. Is that a conceivable world? Is that something we would want to, as reasonable beings, free and reasonable beings, is that something we would want to have as a universal law? Or another maxim might be, I will lie whenever it serves my interests to do so. Or if we look at the gender distribution of goods, if that became the universal law of nature, would we want to live in that world? I think the answer to all those maxims is no. We wouldn't. They would violate our maxim. They would violate the categorical imperative. So this first, the categorical imperative is really a test of coherence or non-contradiction. That is, the principle should never be in conflict with itself. Lying, slavery, patriarchy, etc., fail this test, and they are unjustifiable, one could argue. It's inconceivable that one could sincerely act on this maxim in a world in which it was a universal law, is the idea here. So that's the CI1 approach. So if we universalize it, does it end up in contradiction? The second formulation, CI2, is the humanity formulation. And that reads as, from Kant, act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. And this is the principle, in other words, the principle of humanity as an end in itself. And it constitutes a principle of respect for persons, simply as persons, not because they have met some criteria of evaluation or criterion of evaluation. For a human being to treat humanity in themselves or in others only as a means is to be in conflict with itself. It's to violate itself. So we would test our maxim from this perspective by the principle of humanity as an end in itself, or the second formulation. Treat always yourself and others as an end, never only as a means. That is, recognize their humanity and your own humanity as a test. Does your maxim, does the adoption of the maxim of lying when it's in your self-interest treat others as ends? One could argue it does not. It uses them, it sees them as objects and uses them as objects to be exploited. So it would fail this formulation. This is probably the most common of the procedures of the categorical imperatives that is invoked by others. The principle of respect for persons. So is your maxim or principle respectful of yourself and others? The third formulation of the categorical imperative reads, so act as if you were through your maxims a law-making member of a kingdom of ends. So place yourself as a legislator, a writer of laws, a determinator of laws in a kingdom of ends. By Kant is referring to a just society here, a society that's respectful of all members, that treats everyone, a society that's organized around and its institutions function in a way that is respectful to the humanity of every person in that society. And so place yourself in the position of being in the government of that society and writing the laws of that society, what would your maxim or principles be agreeable in that context? Would it be agreeable to other reasonable agents, fully rational and fully rational and reasonable agents in your community? So those are the three formulations. This can be illustrated by this diagram. This C map. So there are the three tests. So the test of your principles is whether they are consistent with the categorical imperative. The first test is the one of universality. Is the principle consistent with the law of non-contradiction? Propositions cannot be true in the same sense at the same time. A is B and A is not B are mutually exclusive. The second categorical imperative test asks, is your principle consistent with respect for persons? Is it consistent with the principle of humanity as an end in itself? And the third formulation or test is the principle consistent with norms that would govern a society founded upon enacting respect for persons? Or, in other words, would free and equal persons agree to it, in your estimation? So that is Kant's categorical imperative procedure.